stepping forward. He nodded to his friends who pulled out their phones, ready to record. "Why do you hate me so much?" Amina asked, quietly, her voice trembling. "I've done nothing to you." "Oh, don't act so innocent," Olu spat. "People like you are different. You make us all uncomfortable. And if you won't show everyone how weird you are, then we'll show them ourselves." Without warning, Olu shoved her, causing her to stumble. Her anger fled, and before she could think, her power rose, spiraling out of her control. Shadows danced around her, and they bullied her every day without realizing she had the powers of a god. Amina's routine became a grim pattern. She slipped into school like a ghost, trying to be invisible. But Olu and his friends always found her. It started with names and pushed quickly into shoves and pranks. He'd sneak up behind her in class, jab a pencil into her back, or push her books from her hands in the hallway, making her scramble for them as the other students laugh. His words were always sharper than his actions though. "Amina, are you still seeing ghosts in the mirror?" Olu asked one day as they stood in the crowded cafeteria. "Maybe we should get you some holy water. Cleanse whatever is lurking in that creepy head of yours." Our silence seemed to give him confidence. But that same silence was a heavy veil, one that hid a storm. Amina barely understood herself. She clenched her fist, and an eerie quiet fell around them, like all the sounds in the room had been sucked out for an instant. Olu paused, unsettled, before snapping back to his snare, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. After school, Amina tried to tell her mother, Aduni, about the encounters, but as she began, she felt her mother's grip on her shoulders tighten. "You cannot show them fear, Amina," Aduni said, her voice low. "Remember, you come from something far older than they do. If they knew, if they ever saw what's inside you, they would never let you live in peace. They are not just children. They are people with petty minds, and they will turn against you." Amina nodded, the weight of her mother's words settling heavily on her. She wanted to believe in her mother's wisdom, but each day grew harder. The line between her power and her fear blurred, leaving her on the edge. One Friday afternoon, after yet another day of torment, Olu and his gang decided to take things a step further. The boys circled her as she waited alone at the bus stop. Olu leaned close, his voice a dangerous whisper. "I bet you think you are special, don't you, Amina? With your quiet looks and your strange little powers." He smirked, inching closer, his face only inches from hers. "Why don't you show us what you can really do?" The others laughed, emboldened by their leader. Suddenly, without thinking, Amina felt a flash of anger burst through her. The ground beneath them shuddered, a deep, bone-chilling rumble. Olu staggered back, his face a mask of terror. What was that?" he stammered, trying to keep his composure, but his voice wavered. The sky above them darkened, heavy clouds swirling in an unnatural vortex. Amina took a step back, horrified at what she had done. She could feel the power coursing through her, wild and hungry. But as quickly as it had come, it vanished, leaving her breathless and shaking. Olu, however, would not let it go. In his mind, he convinced himself that he was just seeing things, that the strange occurrence was a coincidence. He couldn't let himself believe she had power over him. But a seed of fear had been planted, and it grew each day, hidden behind his bravado. A week later, Olu decided it was time to put an end to Amina's little act. He and his gang gathered after school, waiting for her in a narrow alley she often took as a shortcut home. He had come up with a plan, a final humiliation that would scare her out of town for good. As Amina turned the corner, she stopped, seeing them blocking the path. "Today is the day we show everyone who you really are," Olu sneered, stepping forward. He nodded to his friends, who pulled out their phones, ready to record. "Why do you hate me so much?" Amina asked, quietly, her voice trembling. "I've done nothing to you." "Oh, don't act so innocent," Olu spat. "People like you are different. You make us all uncomfortable. And if you won't show everyone how weird you are, then we'll show them ourselves." Without warning, Olu shoved her, causing her to stumble. Her anger fled, and before she could think, her power rose, spiraling out of her control. Shadows danced around her, and an airy, spectral figure appeared behind her. A tall, imposing form with eyes that glowed like embers. What's that?" one of the boys whispered, his face pale as he stared at the strange, ghostly figure. Amina barely heard him, lost in the surge of power. Her ancestors' spirits had awakened, each one twisted by her fear and anger, and they began to lash out. The ghostly figure grabbed one of Olu's friends, lifting him effortlessly into the air. He screamed, trashing as his face twisted in terror. Another bully, a girl who had laughed at Amina's torments, was swallowed by thick fog that filled her vision with written snakes and darkness. She clawed at her face, trying to escape, but the vision would not let her go. Amina, in her fury, had unleashed something terrible, something that even she could not control. The spectral figures surged around the bullies, their twisted forms now amplified by Amina's suppressed rage. Shadows coiled and flickered, each figure wielding an airy glow, distorting their faces into expressions of ancient wrath. Olu's friends, who had been recording Amina's humiliation only moments ago, now dropped their phones, paralyzed by horror. One spirit, a towering figure with Olu eyes, moved towards Olu, grabbing him by the shoulders. His body stiffened, unable to escape its cold, unyielding grip. Olu could feel the spirit's ancient fingers seeping through his skin, as if reaching inside him to pull out something vital. He screamed, trying to twist away, but the spirit was relentless, holding him in place. "You think you can toy with forces beyond your understanding?" The spirit's voice echoed in his mind, cold and powerful. "You have mocked what you cannot comprehend. Now see yourself for what you truly are." The apparition conjured a reflective surface out of thin air, and Olu's face appeared on it, distorted and grotesque. In the mirror, he saw himself as a monstrous, Olu version of his worst self, his face twisted by every cruel act and thought he had buried over the years. His own reflection grinned back, eyes sunken, teeth sharp, every inch a personification of the malice he had shown others. As Olu stood frozen, two other spirits turned their attention towards Samuel and Yinka, his closest friends and accomplice. Samuel tried to run, but his legs felt like they were sinking into the ground. A force rooted him in place, holding him captive as the shadows began swirling around him. The air thickened, filling with the oppressive scent of rot and decay. In the dark fog, Samuel saw twisted visions of his future, visions where his cruelty returned to haunt him, leaving him lost and broken. He saw himself isolated, despised by those he sought to control, reduced to a miserable shell. Yinka felt an invisible hand grip his throat, tightening slowly. His eyes widened as he gasped for air, his mind spiraling with panic. Before him, another spirit took shape, a dark, hulking figure with hollow, accusing eyes. It leaned close, whispering words only Yinka could hear. It told him of his own buried guilt, his hidden fears, the shame he carried for following instead of thinking for himself. Each word weighed on him, intensifying his dread until he could hardly breathe. He could hear Olu screaming in the distance, and the sound only deepened his own despair. Amina was in the center of this malevolent chaos, feeling a heady mixture of satisfaction and fear. She watched the boys suffer, each of them tormented by visions unique to their darkest selves. She had longed to see them pay, but now that she saw the depths of their suffering, a small part of her recoiled. Still, the anger and power coursing through her drowned out the faint voice of doubt. Then, Mrs. Yewande arrived, a calm presence like a fragile light amid the darkness. She took in the scene, her expression a mix of shock and sorrow as she saw the spirits, the boys, and Amina at the heart of it all. She raised her hands, calling out to Amina with a pleading voice. "Amina, enough! You must stop this. This isn't who you are. Don't let them turn you into something you'll regret." But Amina's gaze was distant, her eyes aglow with supernatural energy. She barely recognized Mrs. Yewande's words, her vision clouded with anger and the rush of power. She lifted her hand almost instinctively, and a wave of energy surged from her towards Mrs. Yewande. The teacher gasped as the force struck her, and in a flash she vanished, her form dissolving into shadows. Amina froze, the horror of what she had done crashing down upon her. Her powers faltered, the spirits hesitating as her control slipped. She looked at her hands, realizing that they were marked with dark symbols that pulsed with a faint, sinister light. The realization of her actions, of the destruction she had unleashed, hit her like a blow. The spirits around her began to waver, sensing her doubt. The shadows receded slightly, but their damage was done. The boys were left on the ground, each one changed by the horrors they had witnessed. Olu lay curled up, mumbling incoherently about shadows and reflection, his mind fractured. Samuel and Yinka sat in stunned silence, their expressions hollow, haunted by the visions they had endured. The chaos at the school left an indelible mark. Students whispered in terrified tones, and the faculty avoided the scene of the confrontation, as if the lingering energy was too dark to bear. Police were called, but they could find no logical explanation for Mrs. Yewande's disappearance. Witnesses claimed she simply vanished, but no one could provide details that made sense. Amina returned home, her mind a whirlwind of guilt and shame. Her mother, Adoni, was waiting for her, her face drawn with worry. She could see the change in her daughter, the weight of the markings on her skin, the haunted look in her eyes. "What have you done, Amina?" Adoni whispered, her voice filled with both sadness and understanding. I couldn't stop it, Mama," Amina replied, her voice trembling. "They pushed me too far. I couldn't control it. I hurt them, and I think I killed Mrs. Yewande." If you have enjoyed the story so far, remember to like this video by hitting the thumbs up button and subscribe to this channel. This goes a long way in helping us bring you more beautiful stories like this one. Thank you. Adoni's face fell. She knew the price of power, the cost of losing control. She had hoped Amina would be spared this path, but now there was no turning back. "We must leave," Adoni said finally. "This city will not forgive what has happened, and there will be others who sense your power, who will come for you. We cannot stay." Amina nodded, a part of her relieved to be leaving, yet filled with a crushing sense of loss. She had wanted revenge, justice for all the pain she had endured, but now she saw the toll it had taken. The symbols on her skin were a constant reminder, pulsing faintly with a dark energy she could not ignore. Days later, the school remained in shock, haunted by the events that had transpired. Olu, once the confident leader of his group, had become a shadow of himself. His mind fractured. He spent his days muttering about shadows, about a reflection that showed him things he wished to forget. His family took him to doctors, priests, and traditional healers, but no one could break through the mental prison he was trapped in. Samuel and Yinka were no better. Samuel, once brash and loud, was now eerily quiet, his eyes distant, as if he was constantly reliving the torment he had endured. He refused to be alone, haunted by visions of his own miserable future. He could no longer sleep without nightmares, and his family feared for his sanity. Yinka, meanwhile, had become paranoid, convinced that the spirits were still watching him. He jumped at shadows, avoided mirrors, and refused to speak of what had happened. His friends distanced themselves, unsettled by his behavior, leaving him isolated and tormented. For Amina, the departure from Lagos was bittersweet. She felt a sense of release, knowing she would not have to face her tormentors again. But the weight of her actions bore down on her heavily. The journey with her mother took them far from the city, deep into the countryside, where Adoni hoped they might find some peace. But peace was elusive. The marks on Amina's skin were a constant reminder of the power she had unleashed. The spirits of her ancestors followed her, silent and watchful, their presence a mix of comfort and menace. She could feel them waiting, as if they were biding their time, reminding her that the path she had chosen would not easily be forgotten. In quiet moments, she could still hear Mrs. Yewande's voice, imploring her to stop, to control herself. The memory of her teacher's face vanished into darkness, haunted her dreams, a painful reminder of the line she had crossed. She knew that no matter where she went, she could not escape the consequences of her actions. And somewhere in the depths of her soul, she felt the lingering pull of power, the dark magic that had marked her as something other. It whispered to her, a faint echo of the fury she had unleashed, promising that her story was far from over. The storm within her had only just begun, and there was no telling where it would lead. Amina stood on the cliff's edge, overlooking the dense forest below. Her thoughts a tangled mix of grief, regrets, and lingering rage. The marks on her hands pulsed in sync with her heartbeats, a haunting reminder of the power that she now carried. In the whispering wind, she could almost hear faint voices calling her name, ghostly, ancestral echoes, as if the spirits she had unleashed were still following her. She felt the weight of their gaze, their silent judgments pressing upon her, binding her to a fate she had never wanted. Her mother, Adoni, approached quietly, the usual sternness in her face softened with grief and empathy. She placed a hand on Amina's shoulder. "Amina," Adoni said, her voice heavy with sorrow. You have inherited more than power from your father. You carry a darkness that we cannot simply run from. Amina shivered, feeling a swell of anger rise within her. They tormented me, Mama. They hurt me over and over again, and no one cared. Why wouldn't they suffer too? Adoni sighed, casting her eyes over the valley below. Power is a double-edged sword, Amina. Even when it feels justified, it can consume the soul. I tried to shield you from it, but fate has a way of reclaiming its own. Amina clenched her fist, the mark on her hands glowing faintly. She took a step back, her gaze fixed on the horizon. She had hoped the journey would give her a reprieve, a chance to escape the weight of what she had done. But every step she took only intensified the ache in her chest, a hollow emptiness that no amount of distance could erase. Later that night, as the village lay in darkness, Amina lay on a mat, staring at the wooden ceiling. The shadows seemed to dance, shifting as if they were alive. She closed her eyes, hoping for a brief moment of peace, but a sudden voice shattered the silence. You cannot run from your destiny, Amina. Eyes snapped open, and she sat up abruptly, scanning the room. Standing by the doorway was a figure cloaked in shadow, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. His features were vaguely familiar, sharp, otherworldly, with an ancient air of authority. Amina's heart pounded, and a chill crept down her spine. Who are you? The figure stepped forward, his face becoming clearer. His gaze was piercing, filled with a wisdom that felt older than time itself. I am your father, he said, his voice both soothing and terrifying. Amina froze, her breath catching in her throat. She had always heard stories of him, of his power and his connection to the spirits, but she had never imagined it would appear before her. But you left us, she whispered, her voice trembling. Why are you here now? He gave a faint, sorrowful smile. I left to protect you, but you have now awakened a power that binds you to forces beyond this world. I have come to offer you a choice. Amina's hands began to tremble, the symbols on her skin glowing as if in response to his presence. A choice? Still enjoying the story so far? If so, comment below how you think Amina's story will end, and if you think the bullies deserved what happened to them. Don't forget to give this story a thumbs up as well. Thank you. Yes, he replied, his gaze softening. You have the strength of a demigod within you, Amina. But this power comes at a price. If you choose to embrace it, your mortal ties will be severed. You will gain control over the shadows that haunt you, but it will cost you your humanity. Amina felt a surge of panic. She remembered the faces of her tormentors, the twisted satisfaction she had felt watching them suffer. But the thought of losing herself, of becoming something inhuman, filled her with dread. And if I choose not to? Her father's expression grew solemn. Then your powers will consume you. They will burn through your body, tearing you apart, piece by piece, until there is nothing left. The weight of his words sank in, filling her with a hollow despair. She glanced down at her hands, the marks glowing ominously in the darkness. She wanted to turn away from it all, to deny the path laid before her. But deep down, She knew there was no escape. "Why did you give me this power?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is your birthright," he replied, his voice laced with regret. "But I never intended for you to suffer. I thought I could keep you safe, that by staying away, I could protect you from this fate. But now you must decide for yourself." Amina felt a tear slip down her cheek. She had always felt different, always sensed that something inside her was beyond her understanding. But now, faced with the reality of her heritage, she felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. The night wore on, and as dawn approached, Amina found herself on the edge of the village, standing beneath the ancient Iroko tree where her mother had often told her stories of their ancestors. The sky was painted with the faint lights of dawn, casting a surreal glow over the landscape. Adunia approached her once again, her face etched with worry. She took one look at Amina and seemed to understand the weight of her daughter's thoughts. "Amina," she began softly, "you don't have to do this alone." Amina shook her head, feeling a sense of bitterness rise within her. "Mama, I can't stay here. I can't be who I was. Everything I touch turns dark. I thought I wanted this power, but all it has brought me is pain." Adoni reached out, placing a hand on Amina's cheeks. "Power isn't evil, Amina. It's how we use it that matters. You have the strength to control it, to decide what it will mean for you." Amina closed her eyes, leaning into her mother's touch, but the words of her father lingered in her mind, a dark whisper reminding her of the price she would have to pay. Just then, the air around them grew cold, and the shadows began to shift. A faint, ghostly figure appeared, hovering in the distance. Amina's breath caught in her throat as she recognized the figure. It was Mrs. Yewande, her face drawn with sorrow. "Mrs. Yewande," Amina whispered, her voice trembling. The ghostly figure turned toward her, its eyes filled with an unspoken message. "Amina," Mrs. Yewande said, her voice barely audible, "I am bound to you, just as the others are. Your power, it does not only destroy, it binds." Amina's heart clenched as the realization hit her. The souls of those she had harmed, those she had allowed her anger to consume, were now tethered to her, their lives entwined with hers in an unbreakable bond. She felt a wave of nausea, the weight of her actions settling heavily on her soul. "No," she murmured, shaking her head. "I didn't mean for this. I didn't want this." Mrs. Yewande's face softened, filled with an unspoken forgiveness. "It is not too late, Amina. You have a choice: to let us go, to set us free. But that choice comes with a cost." Amina looked down at her hands, the glowing symbols now etched deeper into her skin. The power within her pulsed, urging her to hold onto it, to embrace the strength it offered. But in doing so, she knew she would condemn the souls bound to her, trapping them in the darkness she had unleashed. With a heavy heart, she turned to her mother, her voice barely a whisper. "Mama, I have to set them free." Adoni's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, understanding the sacrifice her daughter was about to make. "I am so proud of you, Amina. No matter what happens, remember that you are loved." Amina took a deep breath, steeling herself for the choice she knew she had to make. She closed her eyes, reaching deep within herself, and felt the power that coursed through her veins. It was intoxicating, a force that promised invisibility. But she knew it was a trap. As she released her grip on the power, she felt a searing pain rip through her body. The symbols on her skin began to fade, dissolving into the air like ashes. She gasped, the agony overwhelming, but she held on, forcing herself to let go. The spirits surrounding her began to dissipate, their forms growing faint as they were freed from her grasp. Mrs. Yewande's face softened, a gentle smile breaking through the sorrow. "Thank you, Amina," she whispered before vanishing into the morning light. Amina fell to her knees, weakened and broken, but a faint sense of peace settled over her. She had given up her power, her birthright, but in doing so, she had reclaimed her humanity. As the dawn broke fully over the horizon, Amina remained kneeling under the Iroko tree, her heart heavy with both loss and relief. Her mother knelt beside her, cradling her in a comforting embrace. "You have done what few could, Amina," Adoni whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You have chosen compassion over power, selflessness over strength." Amina nodded, tears streaming down her face. She had lost so much, but she had found something even more valuable, a chance to reclaim her soul, to begin again, free from the shadows that haunted her. And in that moment, she knew that though her journey was far from over, she had finally found a path worth following. "Now, let's go inside, my child," Adoni said, pulling her daughter up from the cold ground, gesturing at her to follow her inside the hut, where it was warm. Amina heaved as she stood, feeling a heavy burden lift from her stomach. She was finally free, she thought. However, as Amina walked behind her mother, listening to her mother having a monologue about how she would prepare pounded yam and egusi for her, she heard a faint, airy whisper. It said, "Amina, Amina, Amina. The blood of your ancestors flow through your veins, and no matter how many souls you release, you can never get rid of your power. You have a responsibility to the gods of this land, and you shall fulfill your duties as a demigod." The airy voice continued, "You are no longer just Amina. You are now Amina Abamieda, and serve you will." The hair on Amina's body rose as the symbols on her hands returned briefly, flickering with a soft glow. "Goodbye for now, my queen." Everything became quiet, but for Amina, this was just the beginning. By now, Amina's mother stopped as she sensed her child's mind was elsewhere. "Amina." "Yes, Mama," Amina replied. "Or don't you want pounded yam?" Amina smiled and replied, "Pounded yam is perfect. Trust me, I will need all the strength I can get." They both smiled and they entered the hut. A small lightning dashed across the sky, followed by an unusual loud thunder. If only the villagers knew that they had a demigod in their midst. The end. We hope you enjoyed the story you just watched. Please subscribe to our channel and like this video, as it helps us create more videos like this for you to enjoy. Thank you.